Russia says Ukraine launched a wave of drones at Moscow for the second night in a row. All four of Moscow's major airports were closed temporarily in what officials say was a safety precaution. There are no reports of any casualties. Ukraine has not commented, but the mayor of Kharkiv said Russian drones had attacked the city and the Kyiv region overnight. Let's speak to Frank Gardner now in Kyiv. Frank, what can we understand about what we think Ukraine is trying to achieve with this?
Sure. Well, I think it's worth reminding ourselves that as Britain and other countries are celebrating the victory in Europe Day, the defeat of Nazi Germany at the end of the Second World War, there is still a full-scale war raging here in this part of Europe. And it's been kicking off overnight in both Moscow and in the border region. So although Ukraine hasn't publicly admitted to launching these drones, there's no question in anybody's mind these were Ukrainian drones that had been launched. And Moscow says that 105 drones were shot down, 19 of them over the Moscow region. And even though none of them actually killed or wounded anybody, symbolically this is quite important. It's embarrassing, I think, for President Putin, who is about to host and stage the symbolically very important Victory Day, the so-called Dien Pobyedia, Victory Day at the end of the Great Patriotic War. This is Friday, the big march past through Red Square in Moscow. He doesn't want anything to disrupt that. So the fact that these drones are able to penetrate Moscow's air defenses is really, I think, will be rattling people in Russia. At the same time, the war goes on in the east of Ukraine on both sides of the border. You've got Russia saying it has managed to expel all the Ukrainian forces that it made their incursion into Russia in August last year. Ukraine says, nah, not true. We are still fighting and we're still carrying out combat operations there. At the same time, Russia has been launching glide bombs. These are big, crude bombs fitted with fins and GPS satellite guidance systems that glide towards their target, often with up to 1.5 tons of explosive in their warhead. And these have been launched against the second city here in Ukraine of Kharkiv, and there have been a number of casualties there.
And where does all this leave efforts for a ceasefire between Russia and Ukraine?
Well, Ukraine signed up to a US proposal back on March the 11th for a 30-day ceasefire. Ukraine had proposed a kind of temporary or a partial one. They said, well, how about a ceasefire in the air and on the sea? And America said, hey, look, we can go further than that. How about we do a comprehensive one? And Ukraine, which was at the time still absolutely reeling from that dressing down that President Zelensky got in the Oval Office from President Trump and his Vice President J.D. Vance, Ukraine was very keen to appear compliant with any US demand, said, absolutely, we'll sign up to that. 30 days, no worries. Russia didn't sign up to it, and Ukraine was saying, well, we hope you're going to put some pressure on them. They didn't. Instead, Russia has proposed this temporary 3-day ceasefire over the period of the Victory Day celebrations. And Ukraine is pretty cynical about that. They're saying, look, the Easter truce that President Putin proposed was broken very quickly. Actually, both sides broke it. There were hundreds, if not thousands, of infractions of that truce. So nobody here in Ukraine thinks that this truce is worth the paper it's written on. Ukraine wants a full end to the war. So does Russia, but Russia wants it on its terms, which are unacceptable to Ukraine.
You mentioned there about the fighting being done by Ukrainian forces inside Russian borders that Russia denies. What do we know about what's really happening on the ground there?
Okay, so if you look at the map, the areas we're talking about, Emma, are absolutely tiny. I mean, you would need to zoom right in to go right up, almost with a magnifying glass to see the area that Ukraine is operating in. It's right on the border. Even when they made their incursion in August and were able to seize about 1,000 square kilometers of land, it's still minuscule compared to the 20% roughly of Ukraine that Russia is now occupying. But it's symbolic. So Ukraine was hoping by this to use it as a bargaining chip to say to Russia, well, look, we'll pull out of the areas we've taken if you pull out of some, if not all, of the areas you've taken. That hasn't really worked. They're also hoping to create a buffer zone. Again, that's not really worked. So what's going on there at the moment is that Ukraine is launching some limited strikes using drones and artillery onto things like Russia's command posts just inside the border. Command posts that are launching drone strikes against Ukraine. They've been hitting them. They also did some mine clearing in the last 24 hours where they were able to drive a path reportedly through a Russian minefield and then get armored vehicles and infantry into just inside Russia. So we're talking here about the Kursk and Belgorod Oblast provinces just inside Russia, enough to annoy President Putin, not enough to change the course of this war.
Frank Gardner, great to talk to you. Frank Gardner there in Kyiv. Now, we have a live page running up on the BBC mobile app and on the BBC website. It's got the latest on the Ukrainian drone attacks in Moscow and the Russian strike in Odessa. You'll find that on the BBC News website or on the app on your mobile devices.